we'll be talking with Professor Mary Beard about her new book, 12 Caesars, as Hannah showed you, Images of Power from the Ancient World to the Modern, which you can see here is this extremely handsome hardback book filled with really beautiful colour images. I'm going to show you some. I don't know if you can see that on the camera. And it's also, as it happens, brilliantly written by Mary, the most knowledgeable and accessible guide you could hope for through the Roman world. Mary Beard, as I imagine many of you already know, is one of the world's leading classicists and cultural commentators. She's a specialist in Roman history and art, professor of classics at the University of Cambridge, and the author of best-selling and award-winning books, including SPQR, A History of Ancient Rome, and Women and Power, a Manifesto. She's also known to many of us as a familiar, trusted and beloved TV presenter, from Civilizations, Meet the Romans, The Shock of the Nude, and Inside Culture with Mary Beard, which is just back on air now, we should say. Before we get started talking about Mary's new book, 12 Caesars, let me tell you that tonight's event will run for an hour. And for the first part of it, the first 30 minutes, I'm going to be in conversation with Mary. And then for the second half, we'll hand over to you to take your questions. You can actually start asking those questions now by clicking on the Ask Question button under the video screen and typing in your question there. And if you want your name to be mentioned, please type it in the box and do remember to press send. You can also tweet along to our conversation, and many of you who follow Mary on Twitter will know that she's an ardent tweeter and a conscientious responder to tweets. I'm not making promises. You can also tweet along to our conversation using the hashtag IQ2. And as a note, please keep your slide tabs open, because we're going to be showing you a series of wonderful images from Mary's book. And although it's lovely to look at us, you might also want to look at the images too. Now, Mary, can we start at the beginning with the title of the book, just in case some of us are not classicists and won't be entirely sure what that refers to? This is a very particular group of Roman emperors, isn't it? Why these guys for this book?
Yeah, the 12 Caesars are the first 12 Roman emperors, or almost emperors. They run from Julius Caesar, who was assassinated in 44 BC, to the Emperor Domitian, who was assassinated in 96 AD. And they became famous, and they are the sort of, in a way, the kind of type Roman emperors, because their lives were recorded in a series of biographies by Roman writer Suetonius, who did a biography of each one of them one by one. So they became a group. Now, they were never actually really a group in the ancient world itself, but by the time you get to the Renaissance and with the rediscovery of writing by people, Suetonius and others, somehow they come to stand for Roman power. They're not the only Roman emperors. You know, there's Hadrian later and Marcus Aurelius, dead famous. But this lot kind of take the kind of pole position in what Roman emperors are. Some of them we don't any longer know much about, but they are the guys who get represented in lineups, paintings and sculptures done in the modern era.
And we're starting our conversation with a couple of ancient busts of everyone's darling, Julius Caesar, perhaps the most famous Caesar. Tell us about them.
Well, I wanted to show people these because I just wanted to kind of remind us all what a Roman emperor, even if Caesar is kind of half an emperor, Julius Caesar, almost an emperor. Now, what does a Roman emperor look like? And I think that for me, these two guys, one on the left recently found in Arles, the other probably a fake actually, from the British Museum. They sort of sum up what the face of Roman power looks like. And actually, let's be honest, I think we see these guys on museum shelves, on gallery walls, etc., and we sort of nod at them. You know, we think, right, okay, you know, Roman bigwig, on we go. And one of the things that the book tries to do is to say, look, actually, there's something much more interesting and edgy about these images than the way we usually take them, which is, even I go into, I've spent my life studying these blokes, and I go into a museum and I see a lineup of the 12 Caesars and I think, oh, 12 Caesars, right? And I was sort of wanting to kind of destabilize that a bit and to say, look, we can make them more interesting than this. But this too is, this pair are very interesting because, as I said, the one on the right is thought to be a fake. The one on the left is just rediscovered, in the last 20 years from the River Rhone in Arles, and neither actually do we really know was or was meant to be Julius Caesar, because most of these ancient busts of emperors come down to us, not absolutely all, but 99% come down without any name attached to them. And so there's a big guessing game, which has changed throughout the centuries, of who actually is who. And, you go into a museum and you see a very confident label, the Emperor Titus, and you think, first of all, who the hell's he? But then you ought to think, how the hell do they know? And of course, we don't really. There's a kind of, there's a bit of a sort of fuss over who really is who, and most of them are actually identified because we try to match up the images on their coins with the images in their sculpture. But, you try matching up a coin with an image a centimetre high with one of these guys, and it's anyone's guess, honestly.
Yeah. But why is it that I think that this is Julius Caesar? What are the distinguishing qualities or characteristics of the person that we think is Caesar?
In this case, there's been most debate about the one on the left, that on Caesar's coins, he said he's shown with a really wrinkled neck.
Yeah.
So you find a guy with a really wrinkled neck, and you think, yippee, it's Caesar. Now, actually, there's quite a lot of people in the ancient world who have really wrinkled necks, but we're so concerned to kind of focus in on Caesar. Yeah. And the other thing that we do is we go to the description of Caesar in Suetonius, the only real description in the biography, and we try to match that up too. But it's terribly, terribly fragile. They're very keen on the kind of sunken cheeks. And so the right-hand man looks kind of quite plausible, but the sunken cheeks, the Latin is a bit difficult to interpret.
Right.
So, and the other thing that comes out in the coins is a prominent Adam's apple. So they look at these and they say, aha, well, I can't really see a prominent Adam's apple in either of these. So it is a mix and match. And I think the important thing for us to realise now is that, I think we often imagine that modern science or, modern studies of ancient portraiture will make it easier. We're better at identifying these guys than people were in, let's say, the 17th or the 18th century. We know better. We're probably more gullible than people in the past were. The great art historian Winckelmann thought that you'd never be able really to find a real, authentic Julius Caesar, because all you're doing is kind of matching things up to coins and to your sort of assumption about what an emperor looks like. So that, my assumption, I have to say, let's be honest, is built on, Kenneth Williams in Carry On Cleo, plus a bit of Asterix kind of shoved in.
Yes.
And I'm always trying to re-find that in ancient sculptures. And that's what people were doing in the 16th century and the 18th century and so on.
I confess to being an Asterix reader and having my dominant sense of Caesar is from the Asterix graphic novels, the comics. But But what you're describing is like a kind of classical game of guess who, right? What do they have?
It is.
Wrinkles on the neck, and is that Julius Caesar?
No,
We were just talking about Asterix, and you were talking about Kenneth Williams. Maybe we can talk about the next images, because part of the argument of your book is how the Roman images of various Caesars endure, how they become a shorthand for power, how they become instantly recognizable, even if they're not exactly Caesar, and they're imitated and appropriated into the modern period. Tell us about this.
Yeah, well, I think that's absolutely right. And I think that although I've been, a bit gloomy and sceptical and a bit of a downer so far about saying, look, we can't, let's go back to these ancient busts. It's very perilous, really, to put a name on them. I think what's interesting is that alongside that, you do get a kind of sense, even among people who say, oh, I know nothing about what Roman emperors look like. They do, because they recognize them in all kinds of places in a standardized image, which in a way looks a bit back to ancient world. It's not entirely unrelated, but has kind of picked up all this baggage from the centuries in between. So I think on the left, it doesn't take a lot for people to spot that is Nero fiddling while Rome burned, because, how many politicians have we seen, dressed up with a bit of a laurel wreath, a bit of a toga, playing something which is almost a lyre, and there's flames in the background, and it says, this guy hasn't got his mind on the job. And that's Gordon Brown for you, but, you could do it with Trump, you could do it with G.W. Bush. It is still a kind of classic meme, really, of the inattentive politician. And on the right, I'm afraid I just quite like to see Augustus advertising a beer, having a beer named after him in my local brewery. What's not to like?
Well, those of us who don't know Augustus, what does that say about Milton Brewery and their beer? No advertising here, of course, Mary. But what does it say? What does it say about a beer to be named after Augustus?
I have to say that Milton Brewery, no advertising whatsoever. I've got a whole series of imperial beers because they have found, like a lot of people have, I think, ever since, that even if we don't know much about them, even if we've got this very perilous grasp not only on what they look like but on what they did.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, there's still something characterful. So you can have the sedate but powerful beer, which is Augustus. You can have that nasty little beer, which is Nero. You can have the really naughty one, which is Caligula.
Brilliant. I think I know which one I want. You've already started talking about Nero. Let's narrow in on a little bit more on him. What do we learn from these representations of Nero? What do we have here?
Well, I think Nero is very interesting in terms of his later reception. He was demonized in antiquity. We have no idea whether he was a real baddie or a part goodie, but by the time there'd been a rebellion against him, his posthumous reputation became as a monster. But I think that what's very interesting is that later ages, actually from the medieval period really up to the mid-20th century, they find Nero, because of the specific crimes that he was supposed to have committed, a wonderful kind of focus of discussion and debate about corruption, about lust, and so forth. Because Nero was a boy emperor, to believe the standard stories, he was eased onto the throne by his mum, Agrippina, who had married the Emperor Claudius. The rumours were that he'd had an incestuous affair with mum, and that pretty soon after he takes the throne, he decides he has to get rid of her, and he has her killed. And one ancient story is that after the death, he sends in the hit squad, and after the death, he he goes along and he inspects the corpse. And he inspects the corpse as a lover, or here, in a sort of more gory medieval version, as a dissector. Actually, as a dissector. What is he after? He wants to know not only about his passion for Agrippina, his own passion, he wants to know where he came from. So there are ancient texts which say Agrippina said when she was being killed, "Strike me in my womb, strike my belly," and we have a story here which resonates, both in the 15th century and the 19th century, of the idea of the emperor and succession from his mother, but combined with an extraordinary kind of sadism. but also, as you can see, when we get to Waterhouse, combined with this attempt to think, okay, so what does it feel like to be the young emperor? And here, everybody looks at this image of Nero, the remorse of Nero after the murder of his mother, and they think, blimey, that's a moody teenager. We've seen those guys, sitting on their beds, not getting up and listening to, in my day it was Leonard Cohen, but it's now, now I'm sure different. But there is a sense that Nero was a moody teenager. And here, I think this is in some ways one of my favorite favorite images to hate of Nero, because it's the image of the dead Nero. There's a rebellion against him in 68. He kills himself. He finds it very hard to kill himself. So he has to be helped to put the dagger in. But the only people who are left are his faithful female servants, who take this still young emperor away to burial. And very interestingly, if you ever go, it's on for another month or so, in the British Museum, in the current Nero exhibition, they actually have the gravestone of one of these women who took him away to burial. But Smirnoff is a clever artist. And in the corner is a really horrible little sculpture, Hellenistic, perhaps 2nd century BC sculpture of a boy strangling a goose. And you perhaps don't notice it at first. There's many copies of this. It's quite famous Hellenistic 2nd century statue. And Smirnoff has put this in, I think, very, very much to comment on Nero. There is this toddler playing with, strangling, killing his pet goose. And you say, why is it there? Well, I think it's there because this artist is trying to say, what does tyranny consist in? Here's the dead tyrant, but is the dead tyrant really like a child who doesn't quite know what he's doing? Is every tyrant like a toddler who kills his pet?
Yeah.
Yes, I think is the answer to that.
I think that's one of the great gifts of this book, is having you attend to those details and to be able to decipher them and understand them in context, and to cast the painting in a different slant. And I should say this image in the book is on a double-page spread, so it's especially imposing and very beautiful. To be clear, the images of the 12 Caesars take different forms. So we're not only thinking about busts and paintings, but also tapestries, like the one we're about to see depicting the assassination of Caesar. Do you want to tell me about this one?
Well, this is extremely interesting. And I think a lot of the images that I put in the book, some of them are dead famous, the Memling's portraits and so forth. But many of them are things that most of us, me included, walk past. And I think tapestries are one thing that we really haven't got our eye into tapestries any longer. And this is really important, and it's on display in the Vatican and barely looked at, actually, in a gallery of tapestries. And it is the assassination of Caesar, 16th century tapestry. Why, for me, that was very interesting is that it is a pair and another version of a set of tapestries that Henry VIII commissioned for Hampton Court Palace, also in the mid-15th, 16th century. And those tapestries have long gone. They presumably ended up probably in a royal skip somewhere in the late 19th century. But the second, as we know from inventories, the second most valuable work of art in Hampton Court, in the whole of the royal collection, was a set of tapestries which featured Julius Caesar in his conflicts with his enemies, particularly the enemy of the civil wars, Pompey. And it ended with a terribly famous scene, made more famous by Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, of course, of the assassination of Caesar. And you think, look, these things are getting everywhere. These images of Roman power and the opposition to Roman power, are everywhere. And Henry VIII's prized possessions were a series of tapestries which ended in the assassination of the monarch. And one of the questions I ask is, how do we deal with that? This is not a glorification of monarchy, and a lot of these images are not glorification. They are questioning about the nature of power.
This is Jean-Léon Gérôme, but it tells a different story to the tapestry, is that right?
Yes. It's a wonderfully different story, because in the tapestries and the one we've just seen, I mean, at the moment of assassination, Caesar is still the centre of attention. He's the star of the show. He's being murdered as the star of the show. Gérôme here in the mid-19th century, I mean, you can barely spot in the bottom left-hand corner, the bundle of rags, which is the body of Caesar. And everything, the whole kind of interest in this picture is what's going to happen next. There's the conspirators, they've got bright white togas and they're lifting their daggers up. And I think this is a rather kind of uncomfortable image, certainly for anybody interested in monarchy, which is because it's saying, look, Caesar's gone now. As soon as you're killed, you're a monarch, you're dead, you're assassinated, you're no one. And everybody is now thinking about what happens next. And monarchy and imperial power is evanescent, Gérôme reminds us.
Let's talk about, I mean, that's a very important thing for lots of readers, for lots of people in power to remember, I think. But I want us to talk about women and power, to cite your last brilliant book. There are no empresses, but there are wives and daughters and mothers who often have important, if ancillary, roles in these stories of the Caesars. How are they depicted? I think we're starting with the infamous Messalina, who's a bit of a favourite of mine.
Yes, Messalina is another wife of Claudius before Nero's mum, Agrippina, and Messalina's reputation within Latin literature is of lust gone mad. She is reputed to have challenged the prostitutes of Rome to a contest about who could sleep with the most men in a single night, and Messalina wins. I think what's really interesting about this, and in some ways I did try very hard in this book to say, look, this is actually Roman power is very male, but you can't, you've got to look at the women too. One of the things you find is that there are hugely kind of lurid tales about the wives of emperors. There's no official role, as you say, for an empress, but there are lurid tales about the wives of emperors and clear worries about what the power of the wife of the emperor is. And in ancient sculpture, if we identify them correctly, and it's the same problem as with emperors, so probably bigger, one of the things that ancient sculpture sort of commissioned by the emperor does is to say, empresses, the wife of the emperor is always the mother of the heir. That is the role. She is absolutely perfect. So you have these fecund mothers in Roman art matched by, or contrasted with, these stories of the danger of these women, who are always liable to get out, to pollute the bloodline, right? And what we saw before was the way artists in the 19th and 20th century picked that up. And so Beardsley, he's much more interested in Messalina the whore than Messalina the mother. And here's another, I think, very unsettling, sadistic image because of the death of Messalina. Because in the end, these women get eliminated. And there is we've seen Agrippina being eliminated, and there's rather, horribly medieval, prurient, all 19th century prurient images of the dead body. Here is Messalina actually being annihilated by Claudius's hit squad. And what's interesting is that the woman in the foreground who's not looking is Messalina's mum. Messalina's mother is there at the murder, and she can't bear to look at it. And what I'm hoping that people get out of the book is that, again, I think that kind of picture, you look at it and you think, what's going on here? Something Roman. But if you dig under the surface, you see that there are really quite important and unsettling issues being talked about. This is domestic violence, actually. That's what it is.
Yeah. There are moments in the book. I should say that it's a deeply scholarly and engaging book, and you don't succumb to the temptation to be presentist, to insist that we read those images in our own context. But there are tantalizing moments where you mention particular people, and in fact, in the section about women, you talk about Ivanka Trump and Meghan Markle, and the way that our political journalism, political critique and commentary turn to the wives and the mothers and the daughters at particular moments when they want to say particular things about leaders.
Yes. What we use women as an explanatory tool to explain the actions of men in power. And, Sean Phillips as Livia in the BBC's I, Claudius is one absolutely classic example of that. And it comes directly from ancient writers too. But we're doing it. We're still doing it. We did it with Sherry Blair. We're doing it with Carrie Johnson,
Yeah.
Who chose the wallpaper? Well, it's got to be Carrie.
Yeah. They have a role too. One of the intriguing questions of the book is the way that the faces of the emperors and their wives are not just of their own time. They resurface eerily throughout the long history of art. Tell me about that.
Yeah, well, I think one of the interesting things, as you say, is that it's not just that we're dealing with modern images of the Empress Messalina or whatever. We're dealing with the faces, the famous faces of Roman power being copied and reused in completely different contexts. Here's a very nice one, because on the right, you've got a Roman statue from the Capitoline Museum in Rome, always thought to be, until the middle of the last century, the image of Agrippina, whether that was Nero's mum, or Nero's granny. They were both called Agrippina. And when Canova was commissioned to sculpt Napoleon's mother, what does he do? He takes that image, which he believed to be Agrippina, and reuses it to represent the mother of Napoleon. And you think, so was that innocent? Was that entirely innocent? Well, some people would say, well, he probably meant it to be the good Agrippina, that is the older one, Nero's granny, rather than the bad Agrippina, Nero's mum and lover, right? And yet you say, so what were the sons of either Agrippina? Well, Agrippina the Elder, the good Agrippina, who this might possibly have been, very unlikely, her son was Caligula. The son of the younger Agrippina, that was Nero. So when you do Napoleon's mum looking like this so-called Agrippina, what you're saying about Napoleon?
Yeah.
Is he Caligula? Is he Nero? What a bloody awful choice.
Oh.
But I suppose in some ways my favourite example, and this is one I think which is sort of really dropped out of popular consciousness. I mean, 250 years ago, everybody watching this lecture, this chat, would have recognised this sculpture. It's now not recognisable by even specialists in students of Roman art. And it was a sculpture that was dug up in Rome in the Renaissance and was believed to be almost 100% certainly wrongly the Emperor Vitalius, one of the short-lived successors of the Emperor Nero, a truly nasty piece of work if you believe ancient sources, a glutton, he's got a treble chin, a sadist, eventually horribly put to death by the guy who comes after him. You know, he had a sort of reign of terror for about 3 months in 69. But people saw this and they matched it up in the standard way. They thought, that looks like the images of Vitalius on his coins. But it became an absolutely unmissable image. That face, it was a recognizable face. It was a Vitalius, and but it was more than that. It was a kind of template of a physiognomy. And what you've got on the slide now is Veronese's later 16th century feast in the house of Levi. Originally, it had been designed as a Last Supper, and it's a complicated story. But the image I want you to look at is the one at the beginning, the foreground. And what you have there is what Veronese described in his discussion of this painting as the carver. You know, he's the guy who's going to come and carve the meat. And the face is Vitalius. The face is the Vitalius that was in Venice at the same time as had come to Venice. And so Veronese is using that, as we now know, wrongly identified face of Vitalius to give an image to this carver. And what I think for me is very interesting is that I think there's something knowing about that this guy is a servant who cuts the meat. In Suetonius's tradition about the Vitalius of the model, Vitalius is the emperor who is actually the glutton, the consumer. So what Veronese is doing is kind of swapping around the roles. And meanwhile, this Vitalius is looking directly across at Jesus in the center of the table. And so you have the worst Roman emperor you can kind of think of, you know, and actually leaves Nero and Caligula looking like pussycats. It's a conversion painting.
Yeah.
But it's a conversion painting which is foregrounding someone who we have to see as a Roman emperor.
Yeah. Do you think Veronese's audience would have recognised Vitalius there? They would have been more literate than perhaps lots of us are right now.
I think
in those faces.
I mean, look, we have to be careful about kind of assuming that everybody in the 16th, 17th century knew all these things and we don't. I mean, there was loads of people who didn't, and they made messes and misidentified. But that sculpture of Vitalius, which had been actually left to the city of Venice, was absolutely the classic, tourist image of Roman sculpture that the city of Venice had. You know, you could not have been in Venice and not known that guy.
Yeah. That's amazing to see it through your eyes like that, but also to understand the painting in that quite subtle context as well. What's this? This is Thomas Couture.
Well, here we are in the middle of the 19th century. Oh, my goodness me, there's Vitalius coming up again. Because if you look towards the left, and I haven't got a detail of this, I'm afraid, but you can see a rather lovely odalisque with a naked back, very highlighted on the left-hand side of the painting. And there's a slumbering figure in front of her who's actually gone to sleep. He's so out of it in this obvious banquet of Roman decadence, right? He has gone to sleep so much he doesn't even spot that there's a naked woman in front. If you go up close and you look at him, he's Vitalius.
Really?
Same Vitalius from Venice. Again, and, I can pretty well give you a pledge. If you go around any major art gallery with the picture of that sculpture of Vitalius in your hand, you will find at least one painting between the 16th and the 19th century which reproduces him.
Wow. But the last few slides we're going to look at are about what you've been telling us, the ubiquity of these emperors. And one of the things we realise in the course of the book is how adept you, Mary, are at spotting them everywhere. Tell us how and why these images of the emperors resurface.
I think they partly resurface, but they partly never go away. And I think they don't go away even now. Although we live in a myth that we haven't really kind of we've forgotten all this ancient history. We haven't really. And here is we put this in because Edmonia Lewis was really the first professional African American female sculptor in the United States, and she has a story which is marked by terrible racist abuse. But she goes off to Rome and she actually leaves America and she sets up shop in Rome to great success. But what's she doing? She is actually making replicas partly for the tourist trade of what's called the young Octavian on the left is her version of it. It's a copy of the person we would now call the young Emperor Augustus, with an image from the Vatican on the right. And again, it's interesting. We now, none of these identifications are clear. And so, of course, we now don't actually think that this young Octavian on the right really was the young Octavian. But right. Never mind. She did. And so she's producing that sense of, I can replicate in the late 19th century, the image of this Roman emperor of the first century. And she also does, as we can see in the next slide, something much more adventurous, which is a statue that she does of Cleopatra. And I think the previous slide was, I think pretty insipid, actually. This is, there is nothing insipid about this. Interestingly, she's doing this big portrait of the dying Cleopatra at exactly the same time as she's doing the portrait of the young Octavian that we've just seen, or the young Augustus. And you say, is there a connection here? Well, yes, there is, because it's that insipid young boy who forces this noble queen to suicide.
Yeah. Wow.
She's putting this together in a much more interesting way than people, I think, often realise. I mean, I think we just have a few end pictures just to remind us that this hasn't gone away. I think people might well say, well, look, we've, we don't engage with Roman emperors or empresses anymore. Well, artists are still engaging with them all the time. Here's, a whole array. I particularly like the Turkish artist Chocolate Emperor, which is another version of Augustus. But we have just seen Vitalius, both in ancient marble version, so-called, and in Veronese and in couture. And here's, very end of the 19th century, Medado Rosso. He's taking the same image, and he's and he's kind of saying, look, this is a blob of flesh. This is an uncontrolled blob of flesh. And it's in the V&A, and sadly, I have to say it's not on display.
Oh, I think I would recognise Vitalius anywhere now. He looks like a walrus. I've learned from you, Mary. I'd spot him at 50 paces.
Yeah, and I can tell you, you find him. There's Jim Dine doing it again. You know, you can find one of the best things. You know, if you going around European and American art galleries, is spot the Vitalius, and you'll find dozens and dozens of them. And that is an image that we've forgotten in a way, when it isn't a recognisable image to us. But I think if you see it and recognise it, and you know a little bit about the history of Vitalius, it makes those paintings or those sculptures speak differently to you. I think it adds something. And you can't see that here, actually. The emperor in the box, in Jerome's gladiatorial scene, is actually also Vitalius if you got up very close. But what's great about this is it shows the connection between this and modern film, because when Ridley Scott was planning the gladiatorial scenes in Gladiator, for the movie Gladiator, he goes back to Jerome, whose painting of the death of Caesar that we saw. We've just seen his amphitheatrical painting with Vitalius in the books. It is that, as Ridley Scott explicitly said, that he's recreating in his movie. So it's utterly embedded in modern culture and popular culture.
Yeah, and that image is instantly recognisable too. This is a moment we turn to our audience, Mary. We've delayed for so long chatting away, but they have been very prolific. They've been submitting so many interesting and learned questions, so I'm going to try and work through them. But I'm also going to remind anybody who hasn't yet asked their question that they can do so by clicking on the Ask Question button under the video screen, where you can type in your question. And if you would like me to mention your name, then do add it to your question, and remember to press send. And you can tweet along if you haven't already, using the hashtag IQ2. So the first question, I'm excited, Mary, is I think this question gets to the crux of things, and I think you're going to have an answer to it. This is from Stella. What did the Romans do with the statues of rulers they no longer admired, and what can we learn from them?
Yes, I think that the Romans were rather more imaginative than we are, you know. Some of them they chucked in the river. You know, there was the Colston treatment for some of us, and I think there's always been that for figures of power that we no longer admire. But I think one of the cleverest tricks the Romans had on marble sculpture, be more difficult on bronze, is they got a statue of an emperor who'd fallen very much from favour, and it had been an expensive work of art for, let's say, our local town to commission. So what do? They get their chisels out and they change the features of the hated emperor into the features of the one they now like. And it doesn't cost very much. He's altered, and hey presto, sculptures have moved on. And I think that for the Romans, and I think also up to quite a way into the modern world, sculptures were seen very much as works in progress. We have a very fixed view of sculptures, they don't move and they're always the same, and they're, and therefore we have a really big problem about what to do with them. The Romans were a bit more laid back about it, and they thought, well, there's again in the current British Museum exhibition, you can see what clearly was a statue of Nero, which has been neatly retooled to be a statue of Vespasian.
Wow. So, I mean, we can't encourage people, or can we encourage people to go retool statues? But it's a radical idea, but not so radical to think that our statues might not be so fixed, that we don't have to, they don't have to be in place forever.
No, and also, sometimes at least with gods and goddesses, I'm not sure if you can show this with figures of humans in power, they just put a new label on it.
Yeah.
Just, this is not Diana, it's somebody else. Right? And I think they were just a little less hidebound about the fixity of statues than we are.
Yeah. That is a different attitude, isn't it? There's a question from Stuart Etherington about the very British Museum exhibition you just mentioned. He suggests that it gives a revisionist view of Nero. Do you agree with this interpretation?
The answer to that is yes and no. And I think it's certainly been interpreted. The exhibition has been interpreted as saying that, and I can see why, that Nero was not a baddie after all, but quite a goodie. I think for me, what I would say is that what it's revealing to me is how these images of emperors were formed usually by their successors. If you are assassinated in Rome, you get turned into a monster. You might have been a monster, but you might not have been. But as soon as the next regime comes along, you get an enormous propaganda campaign. And I think for me, what the British Museum exhibition does is to show us how perilous our judgment is on these people, that it's dependent on the history is always the history of the winners. Nero has a character assassination by the guys who come next, and whether that means he was a goodie, who knows? I think in a sense that judgment is probably lost to us.
Yeah, there's a quite intriguing question from Festus. Brackets, a nice Roman name, they say. I know my question is out of the scope of this current discussion, but were there any African emperors? P.S. I'm a massive fan of Mary Beard. You could just respond to the last bit if you prefer, Mary.
Well, the very end of the beginning of the 3rd century, there's the Emperor Septimius Severus comes from Libya in North Africa, and so he absolutely, undoubtedly, counts his home as Africa. What the colour of his skin was and what his ethnicity was is being deeply debated. He certainly has some biological relationship with posh Italians, but he's also part of a North African community and almost certainly was counted himself in some ways as having an African identity.
Yeah.
So, yes, there were, and he was succeeded by Syrians. I mean, one of the most extraordinary things about the Roman Empire, which, in some ways is, horribly unadmirable, and, brutal and nasty, and don't ever want to go back there. But one of the things that is very clear about how the power structure works is that Rome is incorporating people at the very top of the hierarchy from all over its empire, from Syria to Spain to Africa.
That's
they all represent themselves as looking the same, right?
Yeah.
So there's a real puzzle there.
Yeah. And a great question that elicited such an interesting answer. A question from Norbert, and I think this is a nice question. Which public figure would you most like to see commemorated by a statue?
Oh, blimey. I mean, it's hard, because my normal answer to questions like that is that, please can we actually widen the kind of the category of who we put statues up to, right?
Yeah.
And I think what? Please, can we have some ordinary people that we have statues? So if you say public figure, I think I've got, I think I've got to go for a woman. There is still a gender deficit. Never mind an ethnicity, racial deficit in our public statues. There's still a gender deficit, and I think back to my childhood, and I'm sure there is a statue of the person I'm going to name, but I just remember, Barbara Castle being a sort of whirlwind. and clearly was, I look back now, and she was never going to, why couldn't she have become prime minister? She might have been bloody good.
Yeah.
So I'd quite like a statue of Barbara Castle. Someone will now write in instantly and tell me that there is one, but I will have her.
But also, one of I think one of the implicit thoughts in your book is that a cultural memory lasts because of these works, and so why not keep a cultural memory, someone alive in a general collective cultural memory like Barbara Castle? Yeah,
I think that's true, but also I think that what the book shows is that the people that are in the public sphere for centuries have not just been people we admired. When we put up statues to the 12 Caesars, busts of the 12 Caesars in the 18th century, the people commissioning those busts knew they were a load of bastards. They weren't just putting them up because they were admirable. They were in some ways putting them up in order to have a debate with them about what power was.
Yes. There was I'm not suggesting that this is related to your last remark, but there is a question asking which Roman emperor, in your view, most closely resembles our illustrious prime minister?
Oh, it's always terribly difficult to that. And I have to say that over the last sort of 15 years or so, the commonest question I've been asked by inquirers, but also by journalists looking for a story, is which emperor does, Donald Trump, you name, most resemble. And I have to say that I've come down to the same answer for every single one, which is the Emperor Elagabalus at the beginning of the 3rd century AD. And I say this because no one knows a blind thing about him. And I think, so I always say the Emperor Elagabalus because I then believe that the person to whom I've given the answer will go and find out some extremely interesting things about this early 3rd century Roman emperor. So just try Wiki on Elagabalus and of course you'll have a great time.
And that amazing Lawrence Alma-Tadema painting, which you mentioned in the book.
Yes, I mean, just to give people a little hint about what they might find about Elagabalus, is that according to a truly unreliable biography of him, really truly unreliable, one of his tricks was that he invited people to dinner and showered them with rose petals, so many rose petals that they smothered and died. And there is a wonderful 19th century Alma-Tadema painting which shows the dinner party of Elagabalus with the poor guests being smothered under rose petals, which just goes to show that when the emperor is generous to you, he's jolly dangerous.
Absolutely.
Immoral.
I once saw that painting at Leighton House. And it was sponsored by a very famous fancy candle company. And I wondered whether they understood the disconnect between the rose petals in the image and my candles, but still.
I wonder. Elagabalus is also reputed to have invented the whoopee cushion, invited people to dinner, and when he wasn't smothering them with rose petals, don't believe a word of this, by the way. He's also put them on inflatable cushions, which he had the enslaved people remove the cork from, and so they all ended up on the floor with the cushion deflated.
Wow. I think that is worth a search on Wikipedia.
It is.
There is a very learned question here about Mantegna's The Triumphs of the Caesars. But if there is anybody to answer this question, it's you, Mary Beard. So great conversation. What are your thoughts on Mantegna's The Triumphs of the Caesars? Why do you think Oliver Cromwell kept these paintings for himself after he had sold off most of Charles I's other great works? That's from Rebecca.
I think this is extremely interesting because Hampton Court, where these paintings, Mantegna's Triumph of the Caesars, now are and have been for generations, is a real hotspot of imperial image making, and it's very, very curious imperial image making. Starting with Henry VIII and the tapestries we mentioned, but going further. And one of the things that Charles I brought back from acquired, let's say, from the Gonzaga family in Mantua at the beginning of the 17th century. A huge haul of works of art, including Mantegna's extraordinary set of canvases of the triumphal procession of Julius Caesar. And it's become very famous because it's an extraordinary kind of recapturing of what Roman ceremonial looked like, based on, clearly, Mantegna had looked very hard at the images of Roman victory processions and had replicated them. And it's always taken as a celebration of Roman success. You know, that the Gonzaga and Mantua who commissioned it, and then Charles I, who displayed it in Hampton Court, was wanting to show what Roman success looked like, military success. I've always thought that missed the point, rather, because it certainly is that. There's certainly loads of the ceremonial of victory. But the last canvas is Julius Caesar, looking very gaunt, actually, a bit like the images that we saw at the beginning, in his triumphal chariot. Now, when you know a bit of Roman history, you think, okay, this is his triumph. What was the next big event in Caesar's life? You know what? Well, it was his assassination. You know, he's months from his assassination.
Right.
And I think that, and the recent book by Stephen Campbell on Mantegna comes to the same conclusion. I think that this is deeply undercut, this image of success, because all you have to do is to say, and what next? And all this panoply of ceremony and success is undercut by what happens next. Now, we do not know why Oliver Cromwell decided not to flog these off, these paintings. No idea. He might have been a fantastic admirer on the quiet of Mantegna. I doubt it. My suspicion is Cromwell. I'd like to think that Cromwell saw the message in these paintings, and that he knew that what looked like a celebration of autocracy and monarchy was actually a terrible warning about how it ended. You know, Caesar and Charles I sure comes to mind. So in my fantasies, though I couldn't possibly show you it was true, I think that Cromwell saw that there was a political message in his favour in those paintings. They, all celebrations of Roman military success are always undercut, actually. These were, certainly.
Yeah. Mary, we're looking at these questions, and I'm going to try and get through at least one more. I'm getting the sense that we live in an age where we are as obsessed with statues as the Romans were. This is a question from Inez. Hello, Mary. Thanks so much for doing this. Such a big fan of your work. What do you think of the new statue of Mary Wollstonecraft by Maggie Hambling? Does it do her justice? We're still obsessed with statues. We are. I have to say, I much admire a lot of Maggie Hambling's work, and you can tell where this is going. And I can see that what this statue of Wollstonecraft is trying to do, and I can see this, is trying to not represent her as an individual. You know, it is trying to say there is more about woman in Mary Wollstonecraft than there is about an individual. And so for that reason, I admire it. Do I like it? I'm not sure I do, but I'm sort of pleased that it isn't a kind of representational image like what we've just seen put up of Lady Di. You know, I think anything which helps us move away from a totally rigid way of seeing what a statue of a human being is helps us, even if I don't particularly like this one. Yeah, that's very politic of you, Mary. I like it. We should go and visit it together, and I will try and persuade you otherwise. The last question, this is a nice question. Mary, who's your favourite? Who's your favourite Caesar of the 12?
I think they're all absolutely awful bastards, actually. Would I like really to spend an evening with any of them? Well, maybe an evening, but certainly not more. I'm curious. I remain, and this is what the British Museum exhibition at the moment is playing into. I'm curious about Nero, but I think that I'm very happy to let my curiosity stay on the page. Rather than if anybody ever says to me, "Oh, would you like to go back and meet one of them?" You think, no, or only if I've got a guaranteed day return, back to the ancient world. And I think they're interesting because of the way they have represented the dilemmas of power, and they've continued to represent the dilemmas of power right up to the 21st century. And they make us look at ourselves a bit harder, not just at them.
Yeah, but you've certainly helped us to look at ourselves a bit harder. And it's been such an education, as ever, listening to you and reading the book. Thank you so much, Mary Beard, and congratulations on the new book. Thank you to our lovely audience who've asked such learned and thoughtful questions. It's been really, it's been so intriguing mulling them over with you and with Mary. And thank you to Intelligence Squared for hosting this event.